Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be talking about God and creation in our continuing study of Old Testament theology. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, we looked at last time, but we're going to look at it again. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That word God the Hebrew word there is Elohim. It's the typical word for God. Notice it is plural. When I say plural, you have in Hebrew both singular and dual and plural. Plural is three or more in Hebrew. That doesn't mean we should translate this as God's plural, because it has a singular pronoun. We could say in the beginning, God, He created the heavens and the earth. So it is speaking about just one God. We don't have a plural, many gods here. Notice God created. The word barak can have the idea gave birth to, but here it's created. And there's two ways of understanding this. We could understand this as an initial act of creation. I think that is what is in view here. But there are some who have taken this as a summary statement of the entire chapter. The problem is that it starts off in an unusual way. It starts off with a proposition. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It just doesn't say when God created. It says in the beginning He did that. And notice what is created: the heavens and the earth. Now, heavens is plural, but again, that's because if you point to one part of the heavens, and in other words, when you want to describe something that's really big, you put it in the plural in the Hebrew. We're going to see that a lot, big things in the plural, and that's going to happen here as well. He created all the up there places and all the down here places. The Hebrew shamaim, that's the up there places. I wonder sometimes if it's not from the Hebrew word sham, which just means there. So the up there places, and then aretz would be the word for earth, but also the word for land or ground. So He created up there and down here. We could interpret it. Now the account is going to be what we could call terra-centric. That is, the story of creation, in fact the story of the whole Bible, is going to be told from the perspective of somebody living down here. And notice when I said terra-centric, I put a globe here. But they didn't have a concept of a globe. Instead, they just thought of the land down here and the sky up there. And this is very simple language. Now, there have been a number of theories of creation that have been presented from this passage. First of all, we ought to note the supernatural versus evolutionary character. The story of creation in Genesis chapter 1 is supernatural. That sort of thing doesn't happen every day. It's not still happening. God created, and the universe didn't just happen by chance. Secondly, as we continue both in Genesis chapter 1 and in chapter 2, there is suggested to us that creation had a superficial appearance of history. The age-old question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, we're going to see God being described as bringing forth animals, not baby animals, not eggs, but rather animals. And so that would suggest that they already look like they've grown and developed. When we get to Genesis chapter 2, we're going to see man and woman created. We're not going to see babies created necessarily the day after Adam is created. He will be only 1 day old, but he might look as though he had a natural development, and he might look like an adult person even though he was only 1 day old. Now, next there is a theory, less popular these days, and that's probably a good thing, known as the gap theory. Gap theory looks at Genesis chapter 1 and then verse 2, which says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, but then the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. And the gap theory says, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, that's creation, but now in verse 2, the earth became formless and void. Now, the Hebrew doesn't really support that, but I suppose you could push it and maybe get that, but that's not the natural reading of the text. And so the gap theory says the earth was originally created, and then it became formless and void, and then what we have beginning in verse 3 to the rest of the book, or of the chapter, is 6 days of recreation. So on the first day, second day, third day, those are examples of the world being recreated. Now, I don't believe that the scriptures support the gap theory, but there have been some things that have been suggested proposed as supporting evidence. For example, it is claimed that the verb hayeta in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 can be translated became, so that we would read that the earth became without form and void. The problem with that is that the normal rendering of this term is just was, and it indicates a state of being, and that's how we usually translate it. It's noted that the phrase tohu vabohu, where we translate it formless and void, I actually like the translation desolate and deserted because it sort of rhymes a little bit. And it's claimed that this is a destruction which took place after God's original creation, and it's noted that those terms are used together in Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 23, and in Isaiah 34:11, where it talks about the earth being, in those verses, the earth being rendered desolate and deserted, or a destruction taking place. But the term doesn't have to mean that. It can just as easily describe an unconstructed state, a desolate and deserted state. If I say a place is desolate and deserted, that doesn't mean that there's been a destruction. The desert can be described as deserted or desolate, and that doesn't mean that the desert was destroyed to get to that state. In support of the gap theory, it's pointed out that Isaiah 45:18 says that God did not create the earth void, that uses the same word tohu, while Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 says that the earth was now void, and it's reasoned that the earth must have then come to be in this manner after its original creation. However, Isaiah 45:18 simply tells us that God's intention for the earth in its completed form was that it would not be tohu, it would not be deserted, it would not be desolate. He had planned to inhabit it. And the prophet simply stating the purpose of creation. In support of the gap theory, the darkness, which is characterized as formless and void, is said to be a condition of evil. But the problem is that darkness doesn't always indicate evil. Both light and darkness existed before the earth was finished, and it was said to be good. God saw the light and he saw the darkness. He divided them, and he saw that it was good. Now, a different theory that's been used is the day-age theory, in which each of those days of creation are said to be a long geological age. In support of this, the word day occasionally can be used in scriptures to describe a period of time longer than a 24-hour period. We talk about a day of the Lord. Even we speak about the days of Abraham or the day of David or something like that. Sometimes we do it in the plural, sometimes we do it in the singular. But the word day does not normally refer to an extended period of time when it appears with a modifier, like first day, second day, third day. In support of it, 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8 states that with the Lord, one day is 1,000 years. However, these days are clearly defined here in Genesis chapter 1 when God calls the light day and he calls the darkness night. So in Genesis 1, it self-defines what is day and night, and that mitigates against this day-age theory. In support of that theory, it is pointed out that the sun and moon are not created until the fourth day. That is said to indicate that the previous days are not to be taken as literal, but the very purpose of the sun when we get to the fourth day is to rule over the day, while the purpose of it's called the greater light and lesser light, was to rule over the night. And so there again, that passage in itself points to these days being literal. Now, there is also what we could call the either non-sequential, I don't think that's so much of a good point, but also the framework theory, in which these days serve as a framework to describe God's work in creation. Tim Keller takes this approach when he says, and I'm quoting him, where he says, I personally take the view that Genesis 1 and 2 are related to each other the way Judges 4 and Judges 5, and also Exodus 14 and Exodus 15 do. In each couplet, one chapter describes a historical event, and then the other is a song or a poem about the theological meaning. For example, when reading Judges 4, it's obvious that it is a sober recounting of what happened in the battle, but then we read Deborah's song in Judges chapter 5 about the battle, and the language is poetic and metaphorical. And so Keller is suggesting that Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 are like that chapter 1 is akin to poetry, whereas chapter 2 gives the actual narrative story of creation. He goes on to say that Deborah sings that the stars in the heavens came down to fight for the Israelites. And we understand that she means that metaphorically, and which that point is true. He goes on to say, I think that Genesis 1 has the earmarks of poetry and is therefore and he puts it in quotation marks, a song about wonder, the wonder and meaning of God's creation. And then Genesis 2 is an account of how it happened. Now that's interesting. I'm not sure that I agree with him. I admire Tim Keller. I think he's a delightful scholar, but I'm not sure that I agree here. Instead, I tend to favor a literal interpretation. That is, instead of a non-sequential, I tend to take the story sequentially. And yet maybe there is something about the telling of the story. For example, let me tell you my story. My story is that I first met this young woman. I hadn't even met her yet. I saw her day one. I saw her in a auditorium. She was giving her testimony before a crowd of 1,700 students. I happened to be sitting there with another girl at the time, but I remember seeing her. Day two, I happened to see her again when she had invited some people to the college where we were. We were in a Christian college, and they had questions about the Bible, and I was asked to come and answer their questions, and we had a little impromptu Bible study right there. And I noticed that she was sitting just off to the side, and didn't really recognize her from day one, but day two I saw her again. We maybe spoke just briefly. Day three, she was getting into the elevator. And actually, she was in the elevator. The doors opened. I got in, and between the fifth and the first floor, I asked her out. She said no, but she didn't have a really good excuse, and so she ended up going out with me. Day four, I told her that I loved her. Day five, she could tell I was broaching the question. I was about to ask her, will you marry me? She got up and ran into the other room. And when she came back, I told her, just for that, you're going to have to ask me. On day six, she walked down the aisle, and she became my wife. And every day after has been day seven. Now, these days that I described were 6 literal days in our life of Paula becoming my wife. And yet, even though they took place sequentially, it was not within the space of 1 week that we were married, but rather those days were spread out over a period of exactly 1 year. From day 1 to day 6 was actually exactly 1 year, from the time I first saw her to the time that we were married. I just told you the story using the format of 6 days. And they were 6 literal days, but not necessarily with nothing intervening between. And so as we go from day 1 to day 7, what's involved in the creation? Now, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, but I do suggest it might be one possibility. Now, creation is described in chapter 1 and verse 2, initially unformed, unfilled. I like the translation desolate and deserted, but I'm going to go with unformed and unfilled, at least for the moment. And then the rest of the chapter, for example, on day 1, we have the bringing forth of light. God said, let there be light, and there was light, and there it is. In day 2, there is the water versus the sky, which are now divided. Everything is water, and now there's waters above the expanse, above the sky, and waters below the expanse, clouds up there, water down here. On day 3, we have dry land and vegetation. In each of those sections, on day 1, day 2, day 3, there is the formation of something that had not been there before. But beginning on day 4, we have the light bearers, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. They're not said that way, but they're the sun and the moon. And then there's even a mention, the stars are mentioned also. In other words, those things that give the light was made on day 1. Now those things that hold the light, light holders, light bearers, are made on day 4. On day 2, there had been a division between the water and sky. On day 5, now there is the filling of the water and sky, the fish to fill the sea, the birds to fill the sky. On day 3, it had been the dry land and the vegetation, and now those are filled with land animals, but also the creation of mankind. And then, of course, on the seventh day, there is the Sabbath, the rest. Now, there is the idea here between these. We had day 1, the light and the darkness. Day 4, there's a sense in which remember we said the greater light and the lesser light, to rule the day and the night. There's a rulership idea coming forth. On day 2, there was a division between the waters into the sky and the sea. And now that which rules over the sky and the sea, the birds rule the sky. Nobody else goes up there. The fish rule the sea. I don't usually go underwater. If I do, it's just for a short visit. On day 3, where I have the dry land and the vegetation, now I have that which rules over the land. Notice the land animals are made, but man is going to be specified as the ruler of all these things. And of course, the Creator King takes his rest on the 7th day. Now, Bruce Waltke looks at this passage, and he suggests that general revelation in creation, as well as special revelation in the Scripture, is also the voice of God. We live in a universe, and all truth speaks with one voice. That is, when the geologist looks at creation, and when the Bible scholar looks at creation, we ought to, and Waltke says we do, see the same thing. And I think that he has a point. Now, I'm not a geologist, so I can't comment on the thing that he sees. And I know that there are geologists that say, well, no, the evidence supports one thing, and others that say that it supports another thing. I will let them battle that out. That's between them. But I do think that there is one voice in Scripture. And that if we see it correctly, that it will be in union with what Scripture says. One last thing that I want to note is Genesis chapter 1. As we read this, we ought to pause and read it, taking the Israelite experience as they were reading it for the first time. In Genesis 1, we have light and darkness that are made by God on day 1. Meanwhile, the Israelites had seen God bring light and darkness over Egypt. That had been one of the plagues. In Genesis chapter 1, there's a division of the waters on day 2. They had seen the water divided. They had passed through the Red Sea. In Genesis chapter 1, the sun and the moon and the stars are created on day 4. They had come out of a place. The Egyptians worshipped the sun and the moon and the stars, and they had seen the sun darkened in Egypt. In Genesis chapter 1, man is created in the image of God. In the Israelite experience, only the Pharaoh had been thought, among the Egyptians at least, to be made in the image of God. But now we find out, no, all mankind is made in the image of God. In Genesis chapter 1, man is told to rule over the earth. And in Egypt, only the Pharaoh had the right of rulership. Of course, we saw how that turned out for him. God is the ultimate ruler. In Genesis chapter 1, man is placed into a beautiful garden. The Israelites had come out of a place very garden-like, and they are tempted to return to the meats of Egypt, to the gardens of Egypt. But now they are promised that Canaan is the new promised Edom. Canaan is going to be their Eden, because God has promised a return to the garden.